enterprise. This is your first peek inside this alien vessel. Clearly, this is the main gallery, but it's not safe for humans to go inside just yet. We believe this is the sick bay. This is the facility. Every ship's got to have one, you know. Here are the control panels. This is where they operate the ship. We've hacked into their computer system, and we've learned a lot. Also, no joystick. We think they control it telekinetically. Below deck is the antimatter reactor. Now that's a complex piece of machinery, rather difficult to explain in lay terms. Camera off. So that's what's inside an alien ship, an antimatter reactor that can produce short bursts of intense energy to power exotic machinery like wormhole generators and warp drives. And it runs on antimatter, the highest octane fuel in the universe.
If you had 1 ounce of antimatter and you could annihilate it with 1 ounce of ordinary matter, it would give you an amount of energy equivalent to 1 million tons of rocket fuel.
Antimatter sounds like science fiction, but it's real. And we humans are making it right here on Earth. Actually, below Earth. At a government lab outside Chicago, 30 feet below ground, is a giant enclosed ring 4 miles in circumference. Here at Fermilab, the building blocks of the universe are being transformed into something fantastic.
Fermilab's mission is to do high-energy physics research. And high-energy physics research is trying to understand the forces of nature at the smallest distance scales. To see and investigate small distance scales, you have to have very high energy.
Why? Because the subatomic particles have to go fast, very fast. Fermilab operates one of the world's highest energy particle accelerators, called the Tevatron. Here, scientists make particles of antimatter.
Back in 1928, Paul Dirac determined that we have matter, like protons, neutrons, electrons, and the things that they make up, and particles which have the same behavior, but their charge is opposite. And the term that was come up with was antimatter.
Protons have antimatter counterparts called antiprotons, identical in mass, but opposite in charge. Electrons have anti-electrons called positrons. Antiparticles can combine to create anti-elements, such as antihydrogen. Theoretically, any element can have an anti-element counterpart.
In 1932, Carl Anderson was the first person to detect the existence of anti-electrons or positrons from cosmic rays. And then many years later, in 1955, Emilio Segre and his collaborators at the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory in California created the first beam of antiprotons by using a beam of protons striking a copper target, and they detected for the first time antiprotons. Those were the first proofs of the existence of antimatter.
Quantum physics predicted the existence of antimatter, but until 1955, scientists couldn't make any. It seems the universe is filled with matter and very little antimatter. So the most reliable way for us to have antimatter is to make it. That's what Fermilab does.
We create antiprotons by taking energetic protons and slamming them into a metal target. it creates enough energy density in the target that you can create particles, and there's a certain probability that you will create antiprotons. It's a very small probability, but it is large enough that we can actually create numbers that we can count. For every 500,000 protons that we put on the target, we can collect one antiproton.
This all takes place in the giant accelerator rings underground. They need all that room to get the particles moving fast enough before they hit the target to make antiprotons. After the antiprotons have been produced and collected, the stream of antiparticles must be kept close to the center of the tube and prevented from coming in contact with the walls.
We actually magnetically levitate it. We have a ring of electromagnets with a stainless steel tube which has all of the air evacuated out of it that's about 500 meters in circumference. And these antiprotons that are collected after these collisions with this target disk are put into this ring which we call the accumulator, and this tube is big enough and there's no air in it so that the particles can just sit there circulating.
They have to keep those antiparticles isolated because if they come in contact with the particles in the wall, they will annihilate each other. So it would pose a big problem for beings like us who are made of matter if there was more antimatter in the universe.
It's a good thing that there's not equal amounts of matter and antimatter in the universe, because if I was to sit here in this chair and my antimatter counterpart came up and touched me on the shoulder, that would be the end of us and a good fraction of where we're sitting.
Matter and antimatter combine in a virtually perfect conversion of matter to energy. In other words, 100% of the matter and the antimatter become energy. Even in the best fusion reaction, perhaps 2% of matter becomes energy.
Antimatter is really the perfect form of energy storage because you get all of the energy out of the matter and the antimatter if you can make them annihilate. And that's a tremendous amount of energy. But a tremendous amount of energy is exactly what we need if we're going to power an interstellar spacecraft.
So what about using that tremendous potential for fuel?
Suppose you had 1 pennyweight of antimatter. That's 1/10 of an ounce of antimatter. The amount of energy in that 1 penny worth of antimatter would be enough to launch the space shuttle 60 times.
So what's the miles per gallon conversion on something like that?
If you had antimatter gasoline, you'd be able to travel 40 billion miles per gallon, and that's not even fixing your car up.
Great mileage, except that our nearest star neighbor after the Sun is in the Alpha Centauri star system 4 light years away. That's roughly 500 gallons, or 30 tanks full, to travel to Alpha Centauri. We humans will have to crank up the antimatter assembly line if we want to take a trip like that. Although Fermilab has been making antimatter for over 30 years, they've barely got any.
Fermilab has 1/trillionth of a gram of antimatter stored in its accelerators. At the rate at which we make it, it would take us about 40-some million years to make 1/4 of a gram of antimatter.
That means it would take billions and billions of years for us humans to make enough antimatter fuel to get to Alpha Centauri, unless we learn how to make it faster. Or we could just steal the alien antimatter supply and their engine. The aliens who designed the ship we found have solved many dangers and drawbacks associated with antimatter fuel. First, they solved the problem of antimatter storage tanks. Our alien ship has a miniature version of Fermilab's magnetic accumulator. The aliens also solved the problem of fuel supply. Either they have found a source for it out in space, or they can create it on a large scale, because they've got a huge supply of antimatter on board. But as we solve one riddle, we encounter another. This alien spaceship clearly has turrets for weapons. What are those for? Defensive or offensive? What do our alien engineers intend to do to us? Weapons of mass destruction appear to be a standard feature of our alien spaceship. That's disturbing, but not really surprising. We'd like to assume any alien visitors would be friendly, or at least not belligerent when they touch down on Earth. But the aliens who built this ship clearly would rather be safe than sorry. How else to explain these death ray laser beams built into the ship? Come to think of it, it makes perfect sense to pack heat when you're penetrating space. You'll never know what you'll run into. Maybe you'll encounter hostile creatures along the way. Like us. We're fairly hostile, and we have our own Earth-grown futuristic weaponry. Naturally, they involve laser beams too. And we don't need alien technology. The U.S. military is working on several directed energy weapons.
A laser is just a device that allows you to send out a very coherent beam of light. If you think of a laser pointer that's used commonly now for briefings and stuff like that, it just allows you to get a very intense beam of light that goes a very long distance in a very small area.
In fact, the term laser is an acronym for light amplification by the stimulated emission of radiation. Focusing a laser is so simple, it's child's play. Literally.
If you recall when you were a kid, you probably had a magnifying glass, and you used to use the sun to put a beam of light on a leaf or maybe even a bug, and you could create a lot of heat. That's what you basically do with the laser. You focus that beam of light on something that you'd like to damage or destroy, and you hold it in place long enough to heat it up and damage it or destroy it.
Lasers make excellent weapons for two reasons. One, laser beams travel at the speed of light, since that's what lasers are, light. Two, they can be aimed and focused with incredible precision. Not a lot of collateral damage with a laser beam. The first laser was actually a maser developed in the mid-1950s. It didn't use visible light, but instead harnessed microwaves and ammonia gas to create a beam. But by the late 1950s, optical lasers were created, and today they're everywhere.
Lasers are used in CD players, they're in dental drills, you use lasers in measuring devices. Lasers are everywhere pretty much.
Lasers can differ by wavelength or power. Less than a watt of electricity powers most commercial lasers. Military lasers are stronger. At the Laser Effects Facility at Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico, they can be much stronger. They have to be. Their mission is to blow things up, or at least fry them.
Exo 1, laser on in 5.
The laser is called EDCL, and it basically stands for electro-discharge coaxial laser. It's a carbon dioxide laser, but we use 3 different gases to facilitate making the laser beam. We use helium as kind of a lasing medium, and then we use nitrogen and carbon dioxide.
You can't see the beam itself. The laser light is being emitted in the invisible infrared region of the spectrum. Kirtland's facility studies the effects of high-powered lasers on target materials.
For instance, if someone said, we'd like to see what a laser could do to a satellite, we would evaluate the different parts of that satellite to determine how we could damage it.
The laser at Kirtland's facility doesn't usually use enough power to blow things up. It just burns them. But it could if it wanted to.
It depends on how much power that you put onto the target. You can make a very small sized shot, put tons and tons of power into it, and you're going to have a higher heating rate on that target.
But this is just a relatively small laboratory laser. The U.S. Air Force is working on a far larger and more powerful laser weapon, and it flies.
The airborne laser is the 747 airplane. It's a jumbo jet that we put a very sophisticated optical system in the aircraft, a battle management or command and control system, and high energy lasers in the back of that. So think of an airborne laser as a jumbo jet that has a beam of light that comes out the nose of the airplane that can be directed onto a boosting ballistic missile to destroy it.
The airborne laser began as an Air Force program to shoot down short-range missiles. In 2001, it became part of the Missile Defense Program with the goal of destroying medium and even intercontinental ballistic missiles. Infrared cameras are designed to detect a missile launch. Detection information is passed to onboard computers, which direct a turret in the nose of the craft toward the missile. The turret uses two sets of lasers, one to lock on to the target, the other to fire on it and destroy it. With a range of a few hundred miles, a handful of these weapons deployed in hot zones would be a powerful defense.
And what the airborne laser actually does is we have a deformable mirror in the optics train, and that mirror is used to pre-distort the high-energy laser beam. So basically the atmospheric effects between the airplane and the missile are taken out by that pre-distorted beam. Sounds a little like science fiction, but it's actually a concept that's used every day in observatories around the world. Much of that work is done here at Kirtland Air Force Base, so that's a very well-proven technology.
Very impressive, but still light years behind the blaster we have on this ship. But these aren't even the big guns. Remember antimatter? The stuff that combines explosively with matter to produce utter annihilation? Our alien ship supplements its laser weapons with an antimatter torpedo. There is no ignoring that the alien ship bristles with offensive weapons. But are there any defensive weapons? Our engineers believe they've found a device that generates a force field shield. A shield that deflects or absorbs an enemy's blow is an almost perfect defense. Better yet, don't let the enemy know you're there. One of the first things to keep in mind when you're walking around an alien spaceship full of exotic options and controls is to be very careful. Someone accidentally presses the invisibility shield button and wham!
Many witnesses will report seeing the craft as clear as a truck on the street in broad daylight, and as it's flying away, or even as it's approaching, suddenly it's just not there. They wink, they blink, they pinch themselves. It's gone.
It could be that the ship's instantaneous acceleration just made it look like the craft disappeared, but not ours. Among the defense mechanisms on our alien spaceship is a cloaking device, perfect for sneaking out of dangerous situations. Okay, so it's not perfect, but it's a lot better than anything we humans have been able to achieve.
When light hits an object, it excites the atoms, and the atoms then re-radiate. If you want invisibility, that requires controlling the atomic structure of the atom itself. No one knows how to do that.
fact, some of our fellow Earthlings further down on the evolutionary scale seem to do a better job of disappearing on command than we do.
There are animals which can change their coloration depending on the background they're up against. Chameleons are, of course, very well known. There's some flatfish that can do this also, tiny freshwater sole, which have both eyes on the same side of their head. But if you put them on a bottom which has got any particular pattern, they'll realign their coloration to match that.
The flounder performs its disappearing act thanks to chromatophores, special cells containing pigment granules that enable the organism to change color.
A really striking experiment, somebody tried putting these things on top of a square checkerboard type pattern. And they couldn't match it exactly, but they came real close. The edges of the black squares were somewhat rough, the spacing was correct, and they were approximately square.
Camouflage isn't the same as invisibility, but it could achieve the same result.
If you electrify a piece of cloth and put sensors in the system so that it can, in effect, see, you could presumably change the cloth coloring to match the background in an active way, if you had a little computer to do it.
Invisibility is a nice option. The alien ship also has a force field among its defenses. The force field generator is even capable of repelling laser weapons. However, force field shields and cloaking devices aren't the exclusive domain of alien engineers. The Department of Defense is spending R&D money to turn science fiction into science fact. Here at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia, Munir Larousi is at the forefront of cold plasma research. Plasma might one day hold the key for futuristic defensive weaponry, once limited to sci-fi movies.
This very well could be the force field or the cloaking device of the future, somehow similar to, what people have dreamt about in Star Trek.
Great! So what's plasma?
Matter comes in 4 known states. The solid state, and then you heat it, and you get the liquid state. And then you heat that, and you get the gaseous state. And if you keep on heating that, some of the molecules and atoms get stripped from the electrons and then become ionized. When it becomes like this, we call it plasma.
99% of visible matter in the universe may be plasma, including stars. And it comes in natural and man-made varieties.
In nature, when you have a storm and you get lightning, that light you see that comes from the plasma, that's air breaking down because of the high voltages between the cloud and the ground. It's man-made in neon lights and fluorescent lights. Inside of those, the gas is broken down into the state of plasma.
Dr. Larousi's device generates a plasma plume by applying voltage between 2 disc-shaped electrodes in the presence of helium gas. The U.S. Air Force provides some of the funding to Dr. Larousi. Their hope is that someday, cold plasma devices can act like the fabled cloaking devices and force field shields on TV and in the movies.
We are trying also to apply plasma in a different kind of setting, so the plasma can play a role of a shield or of a mirror to bounce off electromagnetic waves. Instead of having a really solid material that is there, when the plasma is switched off, there is nothing. Then you switch on the plasma, and then the plasma will act as a mirror that you can bounce electromagnetic waves from.
Larousi hasn't quite used plasma as a protective shield, but he's working on it. Depending on the density of the plasma, it could absorb certain electromagnetic waves, such as radar.
Then nothing bounces back, and the radar thinks there is nothing out there.
That's a stealth use of plasma. In essence, you've created a cloaking device invisible to radar. Another use would involve embedding electrodes into the skin of the craft, which could instantly generate a protective plasma shield that absorbs microwave energy.
We know how to make the plasma. However, to take it one step further and to get it to actually play the role that you want it to play as a protective shield or protective skin is feasible, but there is a lot of technical and scientific issues that need to be tackled.
It's going to be a while before our scientists on Earth can build a proper cloaking device. But this alien ship might help speed development. The saucer has everything: laser weapons, cloaking devices, and plasma force field shields. It's almost like the aliens watched our old sci-fi movies and TV shows before they built this ship. If that's what they did, if they copied some of their best gadgetry from our human imaginations, there just might be the greatest spaceship option imaginable: a teletransporter. This crashed alien spaceship that we've been examining and exploring has lots of weapons and gadgetry well beyond our current capability, but not beyond our imaginations. Many of the options we've found on this new model spaceship are ones we humans have already conceived of, in science and in science fiction.
It's interesting to think about the connections between science fiction and science. I think the point is that there's this relationship between the two. They both spur the imagination. And not often, but sometimes you actually come up with the same solution in science fiction and science. But it's really provoking the imagination that is what caused me to be a scientist.
Of all the imaginative devices conceived for space travel, the most appealing has to be the teletransporter, the device that can instantly beam a being from one place to another.
What seduced me into writing the physics of Star Trek was actually the transporter. I travel a lot, and it'd be great to go from one place to another without going on an airplane. And the transporter in Star Trek is fascinating, and I began to think, well, how could you make a transporter? And I thought it'd be a great way to describe the laws of physics.
It should come as no surprise that the alien ship does have a transporter that can reduce an object, including a living creature, into a matter stream, then send it to another location for reassembly. This is truly the Rolls-Royce of alien technology, and one of the most challenging to engineer.
You'd have to take a human being, and you'd have to kind of disassemble that human being and write down the position of every single atom in the body. And then you'd take that information on where all the atoms in the body were, and you'd send that information to another place, and then some little assembler on the other side would just put all the atoms together. And when you're done, what have you got? You've got the person you just disassembled.
But what if there are glitches?
That would be kind of scary to get in a transporter and know that, well, the first thing that happens is they're going to rip you apart into atoms. Would you still be the same person once you put yourself together from raw materials? It'd be pretty tricky to do with technology because it would take, I think, about 1 billion quadrillion bits to write down the position of all the atoms in the body. And how would you reassemble them?
If we stored it all on computer disks, they'd stack from here to 1/3 of the distance to the center of the Milky Way. The aliens have installed a super compact supercomputer that can handle all that data.
You'd need some sort of nanotechnology that could put all the atoms in the right place and get everybody started up again. Still, I'm ready.
There's a side benefit to the transporter the sci-fi screenwriters never explored, but our alien engineers certainly must be aware of. If you can pull apart something into a pile of atoms, then reassemble it somewhere else, then you must be able to take any pile of atoms and reassemble them the same way. In other words, the teleporter can also be a copy machine, a cloning device, as long as you have the information on how to reassemble the atoms.
So the way I would transport you is to take you and scan you and take all the information that makes you up as a human being and transport it from one place to another, and then take some atoms I already have over here and combine them with that information and make another copy of you over here. Great, except you're still over there. That's simple. I vaporize you. Now you're only over here.
So the transporter is not just a good defensive weapon, cleanly beaming aliens out of dangerous situations. It's also an offensive weapon, capable of making multiple copies of their best alien warriors. Again and again, the most bizarre things we humans can imagine are standard features of the alien ship. They may work at a level beyond our understanding of physics and the natural world, but they don't necessarily defy physics and quantum mechanics. Maybe anything and everything is possible.
I always like to keep in mind the one proverb that you sort of go by, and that is, you should always keep an open mind, but not so open that your brains fall out.
By studying the craft, our engineers can tell us how it works, but there's still one big mystery. Where did it come from? In order to get to the bottom of this crashed alien spacecraft mystery, we need to figure out where it came from and who built the ship. Maybe we can spy on these alien creatures from a distance and find out their intentions. But how do we arrange to do that? In a sense, we're already trying to do that. The human race has cocked an ear toward space for the past half-century. If the aliens speak, the SETI Institute may hear it.
SETI is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and really what it is an experiment to try and find out if there's anybody out there that's as clever as we are, or more clever, not by going there or waiting for them to come here, but simply by trying to eavesdrop on signals they might be sending our way. Radio signals, light signals, flashing pulsar lights, things like that.
So why would scientists believe there could be life out there?
I think that if you were to ask the next 5 astronomers you meet, hey, do you think that there's life out there? I think most of them would say, yeah, it's pretty likely, because we now know there are lots of worlds out there. Maybe some of them are like the Earth, but many of them could support life, at least in principle. We also know that life is pretty tough. We found some life on Earth that's living in environments that you and I probably wouldn't want to live in, but that are very accommodating to small forms of life. And, you know, the third thing is that the entire universe is built out of the same stuff. It's the same chemistry, the same physics everywhere. So unless there's been some sort of miracle here on Earth, it just seems reasonable to expect that there is a lot of life out there. Intelligence strikes some people as being a fairly unlikely development, but that's unclear.
The SETI Institute's listening post is nestled in Hat Creek, California, on an old lava bed. The valley and surrounding mountains block nearly all of Earth's man-made noise, providing a perfect listening post for alien messages, assuming they're sending any.
It's a great thing because we look for natural sources of radiation, and any kind of man-made terrestrial radiation is a problem for us. The piece of equipment behind me is an antenna, one of the individual elements that will comprise the 350-element Allen telescope array when it's completed.
The listening post consists of an array of radio telescopes resembling satellite dishes. They collect radio radiation from space. Among all the noisy frequencies out there, SETI listens most intently to microwave signals.
There's a good reason for this. It turns out the universe is darkest and quietest at the microwave wavelengths. And so it's the prime channel, if you will, for interstellar contact and communication. In fact, we use this channel to communicate with spacecraft for the very reason that we can do it most reliably with the least expenditure in equipment and energy.
There's another practical advantage to microwave radio signals.
It turns out that it doesn't take very much energy to send information via radio from one star system to another. And also, radio waves go right through the gas and dust that's between the stars. If we know that, they'll know that.
So what is the SETI Institute listening for exactly?
A narrow band signal, which is just a signal that's at one spot on the dial, because transmitters make narrow band signals. We're not looking for the message. We're not looking for, mathematical equations or anything like that. We're just looking for a lot of radio energy at one spot on the dial.
Listening for aliens wasn't the SETI Institute's idea. Inventor Nikola Tesla first searched for extraterrestrial radio signals in the 1890s. Soon followed by Guglielmo Marconi. Both thought they heard something.
And indeed they did. Something that sounded very intelligent in its nature, a sort of chirping sound coming in the radios. It turns out that this was a natural phenomenon, energetic particles moving in the magnetic field of the Earth.
But it wasn't until the late 1950s that developments in radio telescopes and receivers allowed us to listen carefully to the stars. And astronomer Frank Drake was one of the first scientists with his ear lifted to the heavens.
In the late 50s, I constructed the first system and carried out the first search of this kind at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory in Green Bank, West Virginia. It used a 85-foot radio telescope, and we used it for 2 months to search for signals from the two nearest stars like the Sun, Tau Ceti and Epsilon Eridani, with very high sensitivity.
They didn't have to wait long.
The very first day when we pointed the telescope at the star Epsilon Eridani for the first time, we heard a chirping sound in our radio receiver, something we had never heard before. And it was very exciting, as you can imagine. We thought, can it really be this easy? You just turned the radio on, pointed at a star, and there it is. Before we could establish the actual origin of the signal, it disappeared, and we had to follow that for weeks, hoping for it to return, and finally it did. And it turned out to be from one of our airplanes. But it was an exciting moment.
There have been others.
In 1977, Ohio State University's radio observatory actually picked up a signal which has become famous. It's called the WOW signal. And the reason it's called the WOW signal is that Jerry Ehrman, who came in and found the signal after one night of recording, he was just flipping through the computer printout, and he saw this big signal there, and he wrote WOW next to it. Some very careful searches have been made to try and find that signal a second time, but it was only seen once. And unfortunately, as a scientist, you have to say, well, if I can't confirm it, then who knows what it was, and I can't claim that it was E.T.
So far, no credible alien transmission has been received in any SETI search. But we do know for sure that intelligent creatures hitherto undetectable and within our own galaxy have sent signals into space for years. They would be us. Our earliest radio and television broadcasts are now light years away. Aside from these unintentional broadcasts, we have sent one very clear message in 1974 from the most powerful radio telescope transmitter in the world, the Arecibo Radio Telescope.
We sent a signal which lasted 3 minutes and is coded in such a way that the extraterrestrials can construct a crude picture from it, a picture which starts by establishing a number system. It then shows the chemistry of the key molecule of human life, DNA. It shows a sketch of the solar system. There's a sketch of a human placed in such a way that you can tell it lives on planet 3, which is the one we call Earth. Today, it is on its way to a great globular cluster of stars known as Messier 13. It will arrive there in about 25,000 years.
Who might hear that signal some 25,000 years from now? What sort of commotion might it create? Is it similar to what they'd send us if they could? Maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe what we should be asking is, why do we care whether they're out there or not? Why do we seem to be reaching out to them?
You could say, oh, it's because of all the movies and television shows about aliens, but I think that that's actually a consequence of our interest, not a promoter of it so much. I think that we're inherently curious about other beings that might be comparable to us in abilities, and in this case maybe far beyond our abilities. I think that we're wired to be interested in other intelligent beings. So, in a way, it's curiosity, but I think it's curiosity that's...
Still, Siegel suffered. He was harassed both in his place of work, at the Institute of Aviation, and he was harassed by the state government authorities.
Siegel and his investigators spread information about UFO sightings through an underground press network. Samizdat, private publications used to disseminate information, were strictly forbidden by the Kremlin.
In his time, brochures were printed in a samizdat way. They were collections of observations and letters, typed in 5 to 10 copies. All materials were typed with the use of carbon paper.
Samizdat papers were distributed by trustworthy messengers who secretly carried the copies from one person to the next. UFO information circulated in this covert manner until 1967, when suddenly it seemed as if ufologists were given a reprieve from government censure. Today it appears this respite was a smokescreen, part of an intricate government deception. The complex ruse began in 1967 when citizens reported multiple sightings of crescent-shaped UFOs over the skies of the Ukraine and the lower Volga Valley.
It was also seen as far south as the Caucasus Mountains, where many astronomers in observatories in the Caucasus Mountains would see these objects flying horizontally from west to east, crescent-shaped, heading toward the east.
For reasons unknown at the time, the government allowed press coverage and independent study of the sightings. Felix Siegel was granted permission to form a government-sanctioned investigative committee made up of over 200 scientific and military experts. In October 1967, they convened at the Central House of Aviation and Cosmonautics in Moscow. Their goal? Determine the cause of the mass sightings. On television and in newspapers, Siegel's committee appealed to Soviet citizens to report information on UFOs. For the first time in Soviet history, UFOs seemed to be an open topic.
It was like a breath of fresh air. Freedom of discussion about a forbidden subject was permitted to the Soviet citizens. And this was something unheard of. And alas, it did not last long.
Within a few months of Siegel's televised appeal, the steel jaws of Soviet censorship clamped down. Reporting of UFOs was once again off limits. The subject was dropped from the controlled media, and Siegel's committee was ordered to disband.
The committee was to encourage people to report. As soon as the reports began to gather, somebody in Moscow quashed the activity, canceled the committee, canceled publication of further works, and put a lid on it.
Cries of a Kremlin whitewash were immediately sounded.
Why the cover-up takes place, I don't know. Is there a cover-up? There's no question about it.
But what they were covering up is the question. UFO buffs believe they were covering up alien visitations. I think the evidence is clear they were covering up descriptions of their own secret military aircraft and missile activities and satellite activities.
Scientist and NASA consultant James Oberg came to this conclusion in 1977 after studying Soviet space vehicle launch patterns and comparing them to the dates of the 1967 sightings. He deduced that the crescent-shaped objects witnessed in the sky were not alien in nature, but could be attributed to secret tests of a new Soviet missile warhead.
People in the area saw the rockets, especially at night, saw the streamers, the contrails in the sky, even heard the rockets. They were told by the government that there was nothing there, that it was not anything ours. It became a UFO phenomenon.
Later dubbed by the Pentagon as a fractional orbital bombardment system, the Soviets had good reason to keep the tests secret.
It was designed to sneak under our radar as a first strike weapon. It was one of these scary things that you only build it if you mean to make a sneak attack. It was also illegal to have such a weapon because in 1967, the U.S. and Russia and other countries signed a treaty forbidding the placing of nuclear weapons into orbit.
But why, after crushing public dissemination of UFO information for years, did the government briefly loosen its restrictions in 1967? It appears now to have been a deliberate ploy to fool its citizens and the international community about the true nature of the sightings.
The Soviet government did not want the public to understand what was going on. They didn't want the Americans to know, for example, what was going on. It was a useful camouflage. It diverted people's attention. Because it was a UFO, Western journalists would laugh rather than investigate it. The cover-up by the Soviet government is in letting people think they're flying saucers.
The strategy backfired when the extensive UFO data collected by Felix Ziegel's committee was published in magazines.
The Soviet government realized what these reports really were. They're military secrets. Not described accurately, but accurately enough to be of use to the CIA if they ever caught on. The government said, "Oh my gosh," and other things in Russian, and said no more UFO reports get published in the Soviet Union.
For 10 years, public discussion of UFOs was effectively brought to a halt. But that would change in 1977 with the appearance of a strange-looking object over Soviet skies, witnessed by thousands of astonished citizens. September 20th, 1977. As dawn approached in the small Russian port city of Petrozavodsk, a spectacular aerial display lit up the skies. The incident would become one of the most studied UFO sightings in Soviet history.
The phenomenon of Petrozavodsk is one of the greatest abnormal phenomena on the territory of our country.
At approximately 4 o'clock in the morning, civilians and military personnel reported seeing huge star-like apparitions shooting in the sky.
As it flew up in the sky, it appeared to come over the city and then head off toward the horizon. People who were out in the streets of the town saw this blazing jellyfish, streaming tentacles down from the saucer-shaped bright core.
The impressive display lasted approximately 10 minutes. Witnesses claimed that a host of strange occurrences on the ground accompanied the sighting.
They reported all sorts of phenomena. They smelled ozone, computers were crashing, drivers lost control of their vehicles and went into ditches.
Perhaps the phenomenon most difficult to explain was the appearance of finely glazed holes in glass windows and rocks around the city.
There is no explanation for this fact, but the connection is direct by the time parameters. There had been no holes before the event, and then they appeared.
Witnessed by thousands, the aerial display above Petrozavodsk was impossible to refute. While the sighting remained a mystery to Soviet citizens, NASA consultant James Oberg quickly discovered its origins.
Because of my connection with the space program and my knowledge of satellites and rockets, I was able to find out within a matter of hours There was a rocket launching that morning from a secret space center north of Moscow at precisely the time people were seeing this UFO.
The jellyfish-like display was triggered by the launch of the Cosmos 955 spy satellite. As the rocket engine contrails were backlit by the rising morning sun, it produced the tentacle effect observed by witnesses.
So this what they call basically the smoking gun of Soviet ufology. They call it a Medusa, or jellyfish UFO, because it was streamers of light coming down from the streamers in the rocket engines of the rocket, as it turned out.
As with previous mass sightings, the government had ample reason to keep the truth hidden from Soviet citizens. The satellite was launched from a secret military space center called Plesetsk, one of several undisclosed missile bases scattered throughout the Soviet Union. Most ufologists accept the satellite launch as the cause of the aerial display, but many argue it does not fully clarify the mystery.
How shall we explain the appearance of some beams that burnt the glass? When the pieces of the glass were analyzed at the Institute of Metrology in Moscow, they concluded that these holes resulted from badly glazed window glass. That is, a purely technical defect took place.
I do not believe that the launch of a secret military satellite would explain the holes that were made in the glass. My personal opinion, no, this was not man-made technology that's responsible for such effects.
There were some reports of holes being drilled into glass window panes and in paving stones. I saw those reports. I can't explain it. And all these sorts of additional phenomena, these additional reports, are typical of what happens when people see a very sudden, shocking sight in the sky and look around them for corroborative evidence. Most of the time, it's irrelevant, independent, and sometimes even imaginary.
While the mysterious holes might never be fully explained, the Petrozavodsk incident had much deeper consequences inside the walls of the Kremlin.
The upshot of this incident was the decision of the Soviet government to create a secret program to study UFOs.
In the weeks following the Petrozavodsk sighting, the Soviet Academy of Sciences received inquiries from several European nations concerned about the nature of the event. In response, the Academy of Sciences requested permission from the Kremlin to initiate a top-secret investigation of anomalous occurrences. Although aware the majority of these events were not paranormal in nature, the scientists admitted in their request that they could not provide a scientific basis for all UFO sightings.
The Academy of Sciences can neither ignore or explain the paranormal phenomena similar to that observed in September 1977 in Petrozavodsk. The program was organized to show that we did not know the answers to these questions and would be studying it on the scientific level. That was the way the official scientific program for studying abnormal phenomena and extraterrestrial flying objects started its work in the Soviet Union.
In 1978, the investigation that later became known as Institute 22 was formally started. The study lasted 13 years and was completely concealed from public view. But why did the Soviet government spend time and money to investigate a phenomenon it already knew the origins of?
There's really no surprise that the Soviet military, even if they understood the nature of most of these reports, would still investigate them. The Soviets traditionally spied on themselves as severely as they spied on the West.
If they already knew that these are missile tests, why do they have to have a nationwide study behind the scenes? I mean, it's not like the results of the study were ever going to be published anywhere. It was a secret. So it makes no sense.
While the rationale for the beginnings of the study is still debated, there is no doubt the scope of the investigation was far-reaching. The Institute 22 inquiry was conducted jointly between the Soviet Academy of Sciences and the Ministry of Defense.
It was very useful for the Academy of Sciences to collaborate and to carry out studies together with the Ministry of Defense, because naturally it was much easier for the Ministry of Defense to get the information we had no access to.
The armed forces were ordered to study what, if any, influence possible UFOs might have on the proper functioning of technical military equipment. In addition, hundreds of thousands of sailors, soldiers, and pilots were recruited to watch for and report on UFOs. No one was told why the reports were being taken.
The Ministry of Defense has an enormous observance potential. First, military units are located all over the country. Second, unlike civil organizations, an order from the Minister of Defense is sufficient for making a potential viewer of each military man, and this was done.
Every single unit in the vast Soviet military empire had to comply with this study. That is, any UFO, any anomalous object, any ball of light, any strange thing in the sky whatsoever had to be fully investigated.
Scientists were directed to investigate the physical nature of alleged paranormal phenomena. The data collected by the military and scientists was analyzed in a lab located in a nondescript building in a suburb of Moscow.
The personnel of the laboratory were not numerous. Not more than 10 people, and this number was never exceeded. But the specialists from almost all the scientific areas worked there, from a physician to specialists in radioelectronics, meteorology, and astrogeophysics. Practically all the specialists were represented there. It was done in order to study all possible aspects of UFOs.
6 years into the study, Institute 22 would be called on to scrutinize an incident of global consequence, when a suspected UFO incident placed the world on the brink of nuclear war. The early 1980s were a time of tense relations between the Soviet Union and the West. The era of détente had ended, and the Russian landscape was studded with intercontinental ballistic missile silos. Each contained nuclear weapons aimed westward. It was at one of these silos that a reported UFO incident caused a nuclear scare. Today, this ICBM silo in the Ukraine is deserted, dismantled in compliance with a nuclear arms reduction treaty between the U.S. and USSR. But at this silo in 1982, something went terribly wrong. It started at approximately 6 p.m. when soldiers and villagers in the nearby town of Bielo-Korovichi witnessed a strange object in the dusk sky. A military officer at the time described what he saw.
I was riding a motorcycle not far from here. I saw a large object in the air. It had a perfect geometric shape.
At the same moment inside the silo, an emergency warning light indicated that a nuclear missile had switched to launch mode.
The most telling testimony comes from the communications officer who said that somehow something entered the correct code.
But Moscow had not ordered a launch, nor had any personnel in the bunker touched the control panel. For 15 agonizing seconds, technicians frantically scrambled to stop the launch. Then, without explanation, the launch sequence was aborted.
They were ready for launch. The UFO, poof, goes away. Poof, the command control module goes back to normal.
Had a UFO somehow interfered with the launch controls of a nuclear missile? A team of investigators from Institute 22, the secret state-sponsored UFO research team, was immediately ordered to the missile base.
They established within a very short period, literally half a day, that a military training exercise took place at a nearby aerial ground.
Investigators learned that the sighting occurred at the same time and in the same area where the military was testing flares. Dropped out of planes, the flares provided 5 to 7 minutes of illumination. That explained the strange display in the sky. But why did the nuclear launch sequence activate?
The fact that the emergency situation coincided with the effects which took place is certainly a remarkable coincidence, but it is still a coincidence.
The ICBM control equipment was systematically taken apart and rebuilt, but no defects were found.
It's not just an electrical malfunction. Something entered the correct launch codes. That just doesn't happen every day. We hear from our government UFOs are not a matter of national security. The Russian government has been telling its people the same thing. They're trying to confuse us. This incident is clear evidence, if ever there was, that UFOs do carry national security implications.
After examining the ICBM episode, the investigative team of Institute 22 continued to scrutinize various sightings around the country. Some who reported UFOs had a much closer view than those on Earth. Cosmonauts.
The first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, is quoted in the Thread 3 documents as saying, "I can tell you that UFOs are real, and if you allow me, I'll tell you a lot more." The second man in space, cosmonaut Titov, said that there were 7 UFOs dancing around his space capsule during his brief flight into space.
However, even to this day, most cosmonauts are reluctant to speak about any unusual phenomenon they witnessed in space.
There's a ridicule factor, there's the laughter curtain, there are career consequences from reporting a UFO and taking it seriously.
But in this rare interview obtained by the History Channel, 2 cosmonauts spoke of unusual objects they encountered in space.
Many cosmonauts have seen phenomena which are far beyond the experiences of Earthmen. For 10 years, I never spoke of such things.
Former Commander Vladimir Kovalyonik of the Salyut 6 space station revealed that on May 5, 1981, he observed an unrecognizable illuminated entity outside the porthole of his craft.
The object had an elliptical shape and flew with us. It only flew straight, but then a kind of explosion happened. It produced a golden light, very beautiful to watch. A second explosion followed, and 2 spheres appeared. As we entered the darkness of Earth's shadow, I could no longer see them.
On a Mir mission in 1991, cosmonaut Musa Manarov managed to videotape an anomalous object during a routine docking procedure.
I was looking out the biggest window. It was directly in front of me. I am familiar with the construction of all spaceships, but this was different.
There is ongoing debate about sightings of unidentified objects by cosmonauts and American astronauts alike. Skeptics insist there is enough debris left in orbit to constitute a plethora of unusual sightings. As cosmonauts traveled amidst the stars, the 1990s saw major changes take place on Soviet soil. When the walls of communism crumbled, American UFO investigator George Knapp ventured to Russia, hoping to discover just what secrets the Soviets had been hiding about alien encounters. What he found was startling. Beginning in the mid-1980s, the leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union conducted several summits aimed at reducing both nuclear arms and tensions between the 2 superpowers. Shortly after one such meeting, President Ronald Reagan revealed he and Mikhail Gorbachev had discussed the topic of alien encounters.
I couldn't help but say to him, just think how easy his task and mine might be in these meetings that we held if suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe. We'd forget all the little local differences that we have between our countries.
Reagan made 5 different public statements, including one to the United Nations, that, well, boy, wouldn't it be something if UFOs were suddenly a threat to us and we'd all get together? And so Gorbachev kind of responded, yeah, it sure would. You know, we would get together. Lo and behold, we did get together. You know, the wall came tumbling down, perestroika, glasnost.
With the collapse of the Soviet Union came a new era of openness in Russia. Thousands of miles away in Las Vegas, Nevada, investigative journalist George Knapp, who had studied many American UFO incidents, realized the time was perfect to explore Russian reports.
3 years ago, we had succeeded in obtaining several hundred pages of secret Russian UFO documents and photos. Other Western journalists followed. Today, it's a new ballgame. The lid has been dropped on government UFO files, although there is still plenty of information to be found.
It occurred to me, now may be the time to go ahead and try to find out what the Russians know about UFOs. It was a tumultuous, crazy time, but a wonderful time to be there as a journalist.
In 1993, Knapp traveled to Russia and was introduced to Boris Sokolov, the coordinator of Institute 22. Like many government-funded scientific projects from the era, Institute 22's funding had been cut and the project disbanded. Sokolov provided Knapp with some of the recently declassified UFO files, containing information on the cases that were more difficult to explain.
He had culled from the thousands of reports some of the most interesting ones and had kept them in these binders, and we were able to get them and bring them back.
Why would the Russian military study all of this stuff?
Colonel Sokolov said it was a very practical reason. They knew that UFOs could do things that their planes couldn't. Figured by studying it, they may be able to get an advantage over us in terms of stealth technology.
Upon returning to the United States, Knapp made some of the files public. As a result, Colonel Sokolov was ridiculed by some back in his homeland.
Officially, Russia was a democracy, but the communists still had a lot of influence. There were communist newspapers that attacked him broadly as being a sellout to Mother Russia.
But the public scorn Sokolov endured was certainly less severe than the consequences he might have been subject to in the old Soviet Union.
My friend put it this way. He said, if this had happened 5 years ago, we would be in prison. If it had happened 10 years ago, we'd all be shot for giving up these secrets.
But in 2000, the relaxed political climate allowed Sokolov and scientist Yuli Platov to publish a report summarizing the findings of Institute 22. Entitled The History of UFO State Research in the USSR, the report concluded that of the 3,000 UFO sightings investigated, 90 to 95% of the incidents could be attributed to man-made phenomenon, mostly missile launches and research balloons.
The remaining 5 to 10% could not be easily explained. He was not willing to conclude that any of these things were extraterrestrials or interdimensionals or aliens from the future or anything of that sort.
The thing is that before, the enthusiastic ufologists had affirmed in literature that all we saw was due to contacts with the extraterrestrial civilizations. No, no, no. It turned out that only a very small percentage of events remained unexplained.
But in a land that for so long concealed information and suppressed dialogue, many ufologists wondered if the report revealed the entire truth.
There is a vast treasure trove of KGB documents on this topic somewhere that no one has ever seen. And I know the KGB did release some documents in the early 90s, but it is presumed by a lot of folks that the best stuff is still hidden in a vault somewhere.
What happened to the files? Who keeps them? Until we ourselves go through the files, we cannot say whether what Mr. Platov and Mr. Sokolov say is true.
It will probably never be known exactly how many Soviet UFO files remain classified, or what they contain. Most in the scientific community doubt any smoking guns exist in the unseen files.
People in Russia still have a very powerful sense of gossip and rumors, because under Soviet days, so many things were illegal to talk about, illegal to know. So they replaced the reality with a very rich mythology. UFOs became part of that mythology in Russia, and it's still a very powerful theme over there.
But many UFO enthusiasts remain